some details about each of the planes, and then after we look at all of them, I'll give you a few hints, suggestions on how you may want to present it and how you may want to go about learning all of the information on the airplanes. This mural was painted by a gentleman named Stan Stokes in Palm Springs. He painted it in sections that were then brought to the library, and it took about 2.5 months to compile and put together the entire mural. Let me take you through the planes that you're looking at. The first one here is a Boeing 314 known as the Dixie Clipper. That's the first aircraft that a president actually flew in. It was President Franklin Roosevelt who flew in that during World War II. Because of the threat of submarines in the water, they decided air travel was the safer method for him to go from Florida across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa, where his ultimate destination was a conference in Casablanca during the war with Churchill and de Gaulle. So that's what the Dixie Clipper was used for. Once he landed in Africa, he then went on this aircraft, the green camouflaged one. That's a C-54 Skymaster that President Roosevelt flew into Casablanca for that conference. Then this plane below it is the same type of plane. It's also a C-54 Skymaster. This one was nicknamed the Sacred Cow. It's the first aircraft that was actually modified to meet the needs of a president. They installed an elevator on that to accommodate President Roosevelt's wheelchair. It was also used by President Truman, and in fact in 1947 aboard this airplane President Truman signed the orders that established the Air Force. Next, we have the Independence. That plane was used by President Truman. It's a DC-6. It was named after his hometown in Missouri, Independence, Missouri. And it's often identifiable because of that white beak on it. The next two aircraft are Columbine 2 and Columbine 3. They are a Lockheed Constellation and a Lockheed Super Constellation. These were used by President Eisenhower. They're named after the state flower of Colorado, which was his wife's adopted home state. It was on board Columbine 2 that it was determined the plane that contained the president needed a very specific and unique call number. So that was determined aboard Columbine 2 that his plane should be called Air Force One. So that was the first time the plane containing the president was given the call sign Air Force One. All right, let's move further down. The orange and silver plane. That plane was known as Queenie. It also served President Eisenhower. That's the first jet plane to serve a president. The color scheme is orange and silver because those were the international colors of the Air Force at the time. The planes were not yet given that distinctive color scheme we recognize now as Air Force One. Below it, you see a small aircraft. That's an Aero Commander. That plane is the smallest one that's ever served as an Air Force One. It served President Eisenhower to get him to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The only airstrip that could be used for his farm was just a small grass airstrip. So they needed a plane that could accommodate that. That's why such a small one was used. Next plane here is a DC-6. It's known as a Liftmaster. That served Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Kennedy used it to fly into Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and Lyndon Johnson used it to go to his ranch in Texas. These two aircraft were also used by Johnson. The larger one, the Samaritan, flew him into Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas. And from there, he would get on the Lady Bird Special, the smaller one, to go from the Air Force Base to his ranch. Up above those two is a smaller jet called a Jetstar. That went into service under Kennedy and served through Reagan. It was a backup when a smaller jet was needed. Then we have the 26,000 tail number. This is a 707. It's the sister plane to what we have here in the library. It's the same type of plane as Queenie that served President Eisenhower. The 26,000 took Kennedy to Dallas. It also took his body back to Washington, D.C. after the assassination. It's also the plane that took Nixon on his early trip to China. It was replaced by the 27,000, which is our plane here, that served 7 presidents beginning with Nixon through George W. Bush. Above the 27,000, you'll see one commercial plane. That's the only commercial plane on the mural. It's a United DC-10. It's on there because in '73, Nixon actually rode on a commercial air flight to show the American people that he wanted to conserve fuel during the oil boycott. But the problem was the Secret Service still flew 27,000 behind the United flight for security reasons. So there's really no fuel savings there. But that was known as Executive One while the president was on board, and that has never happened again. The next plane is a DC-9. That went into service when President Reagan was the president-elect, and it served as a backup plane for Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. The next plane is a Gulfstream. That was in service beginning with Reagan and also served both Bushes and Clinton as a backup aircraft. And the gray aircraft is a Globemaster. It has the ability to land and to take off from very short runways, so it was often used in war zones. President Clinton used that plane to go into Bosnia during that wartime. And then we have here the 28,000 tail number. That is the current Air Force One, and its sister plane, the 29,000. They are 747s, so they're about 3 times the size of our plane, the 707. They'll be replaced in a couple more years in 2019 with bigger and modified 747s. Below the 28,000 is a 757, which is size-wise between the 707 and the 747. This plane was used during George W. Bush's term in office for the First Lady, the Vice President, high-ranking staff in the White House. And then we have here what was called Navy One because it was a Navy plane. George W. Bush flew in that from San Diego and landed on the USS Abraham Lincoln. So he was the first president to make a flight that landed on an aircraft carrier in 2003. So that's an overview of all the planes.